Hello again, this is Sickle Yield, and today I'm here to talk to you about VDB smoke formats. This gives us lovely volume smoke that we can render in Daz Studio, and other programs too, but I'm working with Daz Studio, so that's what I'm talking about today. The important thing is that you can buy Embergen, which costs money, or you can make VDBs for free in Blender. In both cases, there's going to be some scale and position adjustment that you have to do. So today I'm going to show you how to set up simulations in Blender and how to adjust for scale and position. A quick note before we get started. This is going to be a pretty advanced tutorial. We're going to be working in Blender a lot. So if you don't have basic proficiency with the movement and camera controls in Blender, I would strongly suggest doing at least one or two very basic beginner tutorials with that from elsewhere before you start with this. Otherwise, you might get a little lost. Daz Studio is relatively easy to navigate, relatively straightforward, but it would also help if you have some basic navigation skills in Daz Studio, which I do have tutorials for on this channel. So with that said, let's get going. So in Daz Studio, I've loaded the Genesis 9 Dev Loader, which is at base resolution and has no eyeballs, etc. It's not super important that I do that today because I'm just using this for scaling, but it's a good best practice to have because if you have it at 0 resolution and no eyeballs conformed, etc., you can also use it for morphing or whatever. So I'm going to go to File, Export. From the Save As Type dropdown, I've chosen Wavefront Object, and I'm going to call it Genesis 9 DS Scale. When the export options come up, I'm going to choose Daz Studio. You can see that says 100% there, and click Accept. Now I'm going to go to Blender. Today's version is 3.4.1. You can see the default cube here that I've added. And I'm going to go to File and Import and Wavefront again. Then I'll just go back to that tutorial folder where I saved this OBJ. There it is. For operator presets, the preset I'm using is Keep Vertex Order and Polygroups, and I haven't changed anything else because these rotation settings can be very unreliable between Blender and Daz Studio, so I'm going to use my own method instead. I'm going to click Import OBJ. Okay, note that Genesis 9 is absolutely huge compared to the default cube because Daz Studio's scaling is much bigger. So what I'm going to do first before I start simming is I'm going to create a box that approximates the scale of Genesis 9 here. In order to figure out the correct size and position of my smoke objects. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to I hit 3 here to look at the figure from the side, and I'm going to hit R, which triggers rotate. And then I'm going to hold Control so that it goes in solid increments, and I'm going to rotate it backward 90 degrees. The rotation shows in the top left corner of your screen, or anything else where you're using the Control key to use specific increments. You probably can't see that on my screen because it appears too small, but that's what I'm doing. And then I'm also going to rotate my cube, and I tabbed into edit mode here, hit tab to edit, and I'm going to hit A to highlight all of this, and then G to grab it, and I'm just going to drag it over to here so that it fits over that as best I can. Now this will behave as if it has the same axes as Daz Studio. This also means that it does not have the same relationship to gravity as the rest of the scene in Blender, which could be a problem for our simulations going forward, but I will show you how we're going to compensate for that. So I'm also going to go Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry. Actually, sorry, I mean Origin to 3D Cursor. See, when I said Origin to Geometry, it jumps to the center of the object, but I actually want it at the center of the world in Blender. So that's what Origin to 3D Cursor does here, is it puts this tiny orange dot that represents the object center here at the world center. So there's our Blender setup. then I'm going to take this and I'm going to make this into a smoke object, because this is what I'm going to use to figure out the difference in smoke object position and scaling in Blender versus Daz Studio. So here is how I'll do that. I've selected this altered cube. I'm going to hit Control A and then All Transforms, which makes sure that our sim isn't messed up by the changes in scaling that I've made and position. So then I'm going to go to Object up here on the timeline, up here on the bar at the top, and go to Quick Effects and Quick Smoke. I'm going to click on that. Now you can see that it has created a domain around that. And if I go here to the scene collection on the far right, it's called Smoke Domain. And it's actually already filled it with smoke on line 1 here. So I'm going to go down here on the far right to the Physics Properties panel. It looks a bit like it looks like a circle with another circle sort of traveling around it. If you hover over it, it says Physics Properties also. So you can see that it has checked Fluid here. And then under domain type gas, resolution divisions 32. That's not going to be anywhere near enough, but we'll get to that. These are the default settings that we've got here. I'm going to go down here first of all to the cache, because this will put temp files on my C drive, and I don't want that. The C drive is much smaller than my other hard drive, so what I'm going to do is click on the folder icon next to that, and I'm going to create another folder in that same tutorial folder I've created. So, which is to say the same folder where I exported the wavefront earlier. So under tutorial, I'm going to create another folder called cache, create new directory, and accept. And now that's on a different folder that's not in my hard drive that I boot from. We need the type to be replay down here, and the format volumes to be OpenVDB, so that's good. Now, in order to adjust our relationship with gravity in this scene so that the smoke doesn't travel upward in the scene, which would mean forward away from the figure, I'm going to adjust the buoyancy density and heat to pretty low here, to 0.2 instead of 1. I'm going to leave the vorticity at nothing for now because we're going to work with that more later. I'm going to change the resolution divisions to 128, just because that's a number that I'd rather be working with as we go on here. And then I'm going to go back to the object that I originally added, this cube, which is still called cube over here, so I'm going to call it smoke emitter in my scene collection. You can see that it has changed it into a fluid type object also, but it's a flow object instead of a domain. Flow type smoke, flow behavior inflow. I'm going to up the sampling substeps to 1. And in this case, I'm going to change the initial temperature and density to low values also, so that they also don't zoom away from the figure in the wrong direction. And another fun thing I can do here, these are the flow source options. I'm going to set the surface emission to 0.25 and the volume emission to 0.25, because otherwise it can kind of create a walled object with a hollow in the middle, and that's not what I want. If you do want an object with a hollow in the middle, go ahead and turn off the volume emission here. For initial velocity now, in Blender, if I hit GY, you can see it's moving up and down compared to the figure, as in Daz Studio, and that's what I want. So for Y, I'm going to put 1. I'm going to set source down to 0.2, and I'm going to maybe put normal at 0.2. And the other thing I'm going to do now that I've got this adjusted is I'm going to go back to this domain, hit tab into edit mode, and I'm going to scale it so that there's some space for my smoke to expand. Because if it gets to the edges of the domain, even if I check adaptive domain, it will hit weird square edges. So in this case, I am going to check adaptive domain over here in these fluid settings. So there we are. And now I'm going to save this because things get unstable and crash a lot when we're doing any kind of simulations. And I'm going to save this in that same folder that I created. And I'm going to call it Smoke Tutorial 01. Okay. Now I'm going to go down here to the timeline at the bottom of the scene and hit play. And you can see it's just going to generate a little bit of smoke there outside of that emitter. It's not going really far because we turned down a lot of the emission options. There we go. Looks like that. So now what I need to do is find the location of my cache that I created. In that same tutorial folder. And inside that tutorial folder is another folder called cache, and inside the cache folder is one called data. And now, if you look inside this data folder, you can see all of these things called fluid data. These are the frames of the smoke animation. So the last one there is 45. I'm going to go with 43, and I'm going to copy it. And what I need to do now is to paste this into a texture folder that can be a Daz Studio directory. So I've created another directory called tutorial, and under that I'm going to put a folder called runtime, please excuse my typos, and textures, and sickle yield 2023 because that is my vendor name and the year. And then under that, tutorial smoke. And then I'm going to paste that fluid data into this runtime textures thing. Okay, now that I've done that, I can go back to Daz Studio, and up on the top left, there's this thing called Daz Studio Formats. I believe I'm using the, let's see, window, workspace, select layout. I'm using city limits. That's what I usually use. And I believe I'm using the dark side option as well. So that's why this looks gray and all of these things are small instead of big and bubbly. Under Daz Studio Formats in my left content library panel, I'm going to right click and add a base directory. And then I'm going to go back to that tutorial directory I created, the second one that has the runtime folder in it, not the first one that has the Blender files in it, and click select folder. And now that's there. The next thing that I'm going to do is to create a Proxy Cube to hold my VDB object in Daz Studio, and also so that I can move and reposition it, because our positioning here isn't going to be perfect, it's just going to be rotated correctly. So in Blender, I'm going to do add mesh and cube again, and this time I'm just going to leave it very tiny. I'm going to hit tab and move it on the z-axis so that its center is at the bottom of the cube, and hit Control A, all transforms. It should already have a simple UV map that's adequate because no one's going to see this object in the scene. And I'll just leave it with a basic material called, I think it has to be called volume for it to work. So I'm going to call that volume. And then I'm going to go to export and wavefront again in Blender. And I'm going to call this VDB volume cube, excuse me, SY VDB volume cube. And when I export that again, I'm not going to change anything here. Currently it says apply modifiers, yes, write normals, yes, include UVs, yes, write materials, yes, and then I've checked polygroups and keep vertex order, and then I'm going to click export. So then back in Daz Studio, I will import this same cube. You can't use the primitives from Daz Studio for this necessarily because they don't have correct material names. And the other thing is that they are saved to the data files already, so you can create dependencies by accident if you're doing this for re-release. So I've got my own cube I imported here. Now I need to add the volume shader. So I'm going to go to Shader Presets, Iray, and Daz Volume. And then right now it's simple OpenVDB MDL volume. A new one has been released relatively recently. I'm not sure if it's available to the public yet. I don't think it's a secret, so I shouldn't get in trouble for saying this. But until I'm sure that that one's available to everyone, I'm just going to use the one we have. And so I double clicked on that with the material selected in the Surfaces tab. And here are my settings. The one that's important right now is the volume file where it says none right now. So I'm going to click on Browse, and I'm going to go find that VDB I saved into the texture folder a minute ago. Fluid Data 0043 it's currently called. And I'm going to select that. And now I'm going to go to this drop down at the top right of my screen and choose NVIDIA iRay for draw style. And we don't see anything because I forgot to turn off clip to geometry. That's very important over here on the right. And we still don't see anything. So I'm also going to set my density multiplier to 150. There's my cube. Now this will serve as an excellent reference for us in terms of what our size in the scene currently is and what we want it to be. So the thing that we exported looks like that. The position is something that's, in my experience, is very hard to correct, but the size is something that we definitely can. So I'm going to correct the position by moving the VDB volume cube using the transform widget and looking at it from the front and side views to get it positioned just right. Okay. It tends to be in front of and to the left of where I want it to be with Blender. I tried putting the simulation object in Blender forward, like backward and to the right to compensate, but for some reason repositioning doesn't seem to work where rescaling does. Go figure. So this is still much too big and tall. I want to scale it down to roughly the height of Genesis 9, so it will be the same as in the program. So I'm going to go to parameters, and with that draw style still on, I'm going to scale, and I'm going to keep scaling until it's the right height. Back and forth here. And then I'm going to drag that back over. There we go. So it looks like this needs to be at about 70%. To be the same size in Daz Studio as it is in Blender. 70.2% there. So back in Blender, I'm going to left click on my smoke emitter to select it and hit S and 0.72. Now it looks like it's inside of the figure, but we're not using the figure for collision or anything, so that currently doesn't matter. What I can do, though, is I can select the figure itself again and also scale it to 0.72, so it fits back inside the box again. The domain, if I hit Tab from object mode, you can see that's what its position is, so I can scale it down and move it around as well. When I hit Tab back into object mode here, it looks like it's in the wrong place, so I'm going to hit all transforms after I hit Control A there. It's still in the wrong place, but part of the reason is because it's still preserving old frames from the animation. So I'm going to go over here and hit 0 on the timeline in this little box on the bottom right. And I'm going to go find our cache folder that we created under the tutorial Blender content, not the Daz Studio directory. And inside that cache, I'm going to find these two folders called config and data, and I'm going to delete them. There we go. So sometimes, there we go. Now it has reset to the proper position. Sometimes this works. If it doesn't, you might have to restart Blender. I have to restart Blender a lot of times when I'm working with smoke simulations normally, because sometimes the cache clears itself correctly, and sometimes it does not. So now we're ready, having scaled our thing down and scaled Genesis 9 down inside that smoke emitter to try and run it again. I'm not going to spend a lot of frames on this because this is our scaling test. There we go. 19 should do it. And you can see the config and data folders have reappeared there, so I can just go get frame 18 and paste it into that same texture folder we created. This is a long setup process, but once you've done it, you should only have to do it once. with all of this scaling and export, etc. So then I'll go back to Daz Studio to the volume cube to the surfaces tab. And where I've got the fluid volume file drop down, I'm going to browse to 18 there that we just exported. And now I'm going to look at it again. Well, I adjusted the position when it was the wrong scale. So now I'm going to hit Control E on the volume cube. And now it is the right size. It's just in kind of the wrong position. So now all I have to adjust is the position of the cube. Now it actually looks a little bit small. So I might go back to Blender. I'm just kind of eyeballing it here now. This is all very vague, and I know that's annoying, but I'm going to scale my object and figure in Blender again, and I'm just going to keep tweaking this, redoing the sim again and again until I have it the size that I want it to be. I think one more round will probably do it. Okay, 14 frames there. Okay, that's not too bad. It's still a little small, but you get the idea what I'm doing here. And you can continue making your own adjustments until Genesis 9 and the simulation cube are a size in Blender that relatively matches what the export size in Daz Studio is going to be. Ultimately, you have to decide how much scaling and positioning you want to do in Blender versus in Daz Studio. We are going to have to use sort of a scene subset to make movement, etc. easier anyway, so keep that in mind. But here's where I roughly ended up. I'm going to go back to texture shaded. I'm going to go back to Blender. I'm going to clear the cache and save everything. And in this case, I am going to restart the program just in case, because again, there will be a loss of stability going on over the course of this for the longer I run Blender, and especially the longer I run it doing simulations, even on a relatively beefy computer like the one that I'm running. Okay, I'm going to save my changes. I'm going to close that. I also recommend that when you save a simulated scene in Blender, you change the, well, I'll show you here. Hang on. I'm reopening this tutorial scene. There we go. I recommend that you change the resolution divisions in the domain, especially down to 128 or 64, because if you save with resolution divisions at 256 or 512 or higher, it will take a long time to reopen the scene, and there's not much point in trying to preserve the cache other than copying it to another folder, because Blender will randomly lose it or erase it for reasons that aren't always clear. So don't depend on actually saving the entire simulation much. What we do is we set up the conditions, and then we set up the domain, and then we have the scene that we can restart as needed. So here we are again in Blender. Now I'm ready to actually create my own object to emit from, and I want it to be smoke-shaped. And the best way to control that is to have a smoke-shaped mesh when I start. So I'm going to go with Add and Metaball in Blender, and I'm going to use in this case, ball, and I'm going to scale it and position it around the figure's feet here. And then when I hit Tab into edit mode, you can see it looks different than a mesh normally does. To select it, I can kind of click on these rings. And when I hit Shift D, it creates another metaball here. Let me go to solid mode. There we go. I use Shift Z there to go in and out of wireframe in Blender. So I just created this second metaball in edit mode there. And when I drag that around, you can see it kind of goopily sticks to the first one. So using Shift D and the grab controls, I'm going to create a sort of pillar or column of smoke. You can move these in all directions and rotate them and scale them to create different little protuberances in your smoke. And metaballs are about the best tool you can use for creating a globby, irregular object. And the other thing is that this is non-destructive, so you can continue moving any metaball that you've already moved, even though it appears merged with all of the others. So I'm going to create this metaball smoke column. And I'm even going to do Shift D and then rotate on Y, just to quickly get more of that done, and then I'm going to scale that down and move it. There we go. All right. Now I've got a globby smoke column, which I can move around. When I go to object mode, I can move the whole mass together. And then I'm going to also change the size of my domain so that it's fully around the outside of this. In fact, I'm going to give it lots of room outside of that for it to expand and move, because I want to have some turbulence to my smoke this time. So there's my meta object. I'm going to go to Object, Convert, Mesh. Now it's a mesh. When I hit Tab, it has square geometry. That doesn't look real great. I'm actually going to remesh that. I use a plugin called Quad Remesh. I think it cost me $50, but there are free ones you can get. There's different options you can use. This has about 2,000 polygons, so I'm going to remesh it to that size. There we go. I'm just using this as a proxy, so the UV doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to hit U and Smart UV Project and ignore that forever from now on. And I'm not even going to give it a material. It'll just come up as none in Daz Studio. Because again, this is a proxy so that we can see where the smoke will be placed in a scene in Daz Studio. I'm also going to do Object Origin 3D Cursor so it goes back to the center again. So now I've got an object I can use as a smoke emitter. I'm going to go to the physics panel over here on the right. Looks like a opaque circle with another circle kind of orbiting it. Click on Fluid. Click on Flow. It's already on smoke, so I'm going to click on Inflow. Sampling substeps to 1. Initial temperature and density to 0.2. Flow source, mesh. And I'm going to set surface emission pretty low and then volume emission to 0.5 because I want it to fill the entire interior of this and then emit outwards from it. And then for initial velocity, I'm going to set source and normal to low values. And I'm going to set Y to 2 because the Y-axis is the one that I want to be as if it were vertical, not the one that's actually vertical according to the gravity of Blender, if that makes sense. Because of the way that we've rotated this onto its back. If I were to just leave it with the default settings, the smoke would move in a way that isn't what we want. There we go. And I've got that ready to go, I think, so I'm going to save. I'm going to go to my domain here and set it to 256 because I need this to look better. And the less high res the smoke is, the blockier it will look in Daz Studio subsequently. Now I'm going to actually go down to the gas drop down here in these physics settings and set vorticity to 0.25 because I want a little bit of turbulence, and I'm going to use noise also. Click on noise. I'm going to set strength to 0.5 and scale to 0.5. Okay, there's our caches ready to go. I'm going to save again. Well, I'm going to go up and set it to 64 on resolution divisions and then save again, and then set it back to 256 to do the actual sim. There we go. Let's see how we do. Another thing that's going to happen when I do simulations at higher resolution is that Blender is going to be less responsive to me when I try to click on the pause button on the timeline down here at the bottom. So this is a point where I would maybe go eat a sandwich or something, or do some laundry, or other things I can do away from the computer, because this is going to eat up pretty much all of my processor cycles. Here's my task manager. You can see it's going to be using up, it's not that much of my CPU at the moment, actually. It's only about 40%. That'll creep upward over the course of the day and over the course of doing different sims until it'll be like in the 80-90% range. As you can see, it barely uses the GPU. Blender won't use the GPU for simulations, unfortunately. That is an advantage that some other programs have over it because it's hard to replace a CPU, but relatively easy to replace a graphics card. And most people will replace a graphics card many times over the life of their PC and not replace the CPU at all. So that is a downside to working with Blender here. Okay, here we go. I'm going to try and pause it. I'm going to have to hold the mouse down real hard and not let go for a good 10 seconds for it to register that. And there we go. It actually did stop. And if I hit Shift Z again, you can kind of see my smoke there. If I hide the metaball that I retopologized, smoke looks like that. So there's kind of my smoke column. And I can go to that cache again and copy, say, frame 32 here, and put that back into my textures folder that we talked about earlier that we created. And you can see the edges are a little shaggy in Blender, which is what we want. I wanted a little vorticity so it doesn't just look like the smooth metaball object. And I'm going to go to my volume cube in Daz Studio and volume file and navigate to that one we just exported. And let's see, I'm probably going to have to reposition it again because that's going to be the case with like every object. You can see some of the grain of it here from the chunkiness of the simulation. If I set it to 1024, I might be able to get rid of that, but it would take 12 times as long, so I'm probably going to use it like this and set the density multiplier to something lower, like 40. Because at 40 or 35 or 40, it's still relatively opaque. You can see I could just barely see Genesis 9 through it, but it looks softer and it doesn't look chunky and grainy. So I'm going to reposition my smoke around where I want it by repositioning that cube to ensure that it's at roughly center scene. And now we're ready to save that volume cube and save this as a scene subset. So the way that I'm going to do that is I've got this volume cube named now, and I'm going to go File, Save As, Support Asset, Figure Prop Asset. And I need to save it in that same directory as that runtime folder we created. So in that folder, I'm going to create another folder called Props. And under that, sickle yield, because Daz is now requiring us to have a vendor name folder as of this moment in 2023. Sickle yield, tutorial, smoke. And then under that, I'm going to create another folder called utilities, because this isn't, the user never really needs to use this volume cube, but I need to use it. So call that volume cube. And then it's going to come up with this save options dialog. You can see that under asset directory, there's a drop down there that I can make sure it shows the tutorial one. I'm going to make sure my vendor name is Sickle Yield 2023. My product name is tutorial, and it's already given an item name there. And I can also set a content type for the metadata. In this case, I'm probably going to call it a prop. So it will show up under props in Smart Content. Then I'll click Accept. And now I'm ready to create a proxy so that I can see where that smoke will actually go. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to Blender. And I'm going to take that metaball thing that I made, duplicate it with Shift D, and then in the side view, I'm going to hit R and 90, negative 90 actually, to make it upright again. So now from Blender's perspective, this is upright again, and I can export this to Wavefront to use as my proxy. So I'm going to call this tutorial smoke. I'm going to leave that at 100% there. There we go. You can see that looks a bit small, so I'm probably going to need to scale and position the volume cube to fit inside that, and then I can rescale that to whatever size I want it to have in my scene. So what I'm doing now is scaling and positioning the volume cube to match up the scale and position of that proxy, or I could go back to Blender and make the proxy bigger. That's another option. Then I'm going to, once I've already got it scaled and positioned, not before, only after, then I will go to the Scene tab in Daz Studio and I will drag the volume cube onto the tutorial smoke to make one a parent of the other. And then I'm going to go and click on the tutorial smoke there again. And in the parameters tab under display, I will click on visible in render from on to off. So now when the render is done, you can see the smoke, but not the proxy. And when I click on texture shaded back into the preview, you can see the proxy because the smoke won't show up. So I need to save this tutorial smoke as an object also with File, Save As, Support Asset, Figure Prop Assets. And I won't save it in the, I will probably save it in that same utilities folder actually. So I will call it, same thing, tutorial smoke. And again, I'll set the content type as prop and accept. And now I'm ready to save as a scene subset. This is the thing you will want to load again from the library. So File, Save As, Scene Subset. You have to resave both other components as figure prop assets first, or this will not load properly. So this is going to go back in that same props folder, but instead of under utilities, it's going to go under the main node. And I'm just going to call it tutorial smoke column so that it has a different name from either of the other two things. If I'm releasing this as a product, I will move and or delete that utilities folder because my end user doesn't need it, but I do. So it'll be in my work in progress files, but not in the final product. With that saved, I can delete this. And now, when I go back to that tutorial directory and the props folder that we created, there is my tutorial smoke. It doesn't have a real icon. That's something that I would also do for a professional product. But when I click on that, it appears in the scene. And when I render it, there's the smoke. And there we go. We've created a VDB smoke object in Blender. I hope that that's clear. If it's not, you can contact me on here or on DeviantArt. I don't look at the comments a lot because they are YouTube comments, but you can also contact me on the Daz forums, and I'm also on Twitter sometimes as @iHeartSpiders. Thank you so much for watching. If you got this far, I know this was a long, difficult tutorial, and I appreciate it, so thank you very much for watching, and happy rendering.